Thank you very much, Professor Robert, for your generous introductory words. State Secretary Koenig, Professor Lenk, Professor Eisenecker, Professor zu Kniphausen-Aufses, Professor Schmidt, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I am very honored to have been invited by the Verband der Hochschullehrer für Betriebswirtschaft on this important occasion, and I'm doubly honored and pleased that this takes place in Leipzig, at the University of Leipzig. And we have just seen that this is a particularly appropriate and highly dignified university to talk about European topics, and not only them, but European topics, because among the alumni of this great university we have the man whose first and most visionary concept Robert Schuman brought to the birth of the European Union. Sometimes I think if 1950, when Schuman brought out on the 9th of May his famous declaration that we celebrate each year, had been today with the current methods, which of course require democratic legitimation for almost each step. For sure, the very visionary proposal, just a few years after the war, that Germany and France and also Italy and the Benelux countries should bring together the very instruments through which they had more than once fought wars among each other in the previous decades. And if that proposal had been put to a referendum, I think we can be sure that we would never have seen the birth of the European steel and coal and steel community, and subsequently of the European Union. So this sometimes makes me reflect on how the vision of elites and the absolutely necessary democratic push from the citizens should be combined in present-day Europe. So the man who was the founder with such a vision, and another alumnus, the woman, Chancellor Merkel, who is now, and looks like she will be for a number of years, the key factor in determining the future of the European Union. So, if this was a Greek university, it would cover from the alpha to the omega of European integration. And it's a pity that I'm not an alumnus, but just a simple honorary doctor at this university. I'm also pleased to have this opportunity this morning because in my academic life I have become to be known in Italy as the most German among Italian economists. I'm not sure that those pronouncing that nickname were really meaning a compliment, but I always took it as such. And then in my work on a more practical basis in Brussels as European Commissioner, and then for a short time in Italy as Prime Minister I must say that my cooperation with Germany, I've been lucky enough that it has always been very profound, very transparent, and I think very fruitful. Both when my role was to be on the attack side, when I was competition commissioner, and I had to, let me put this way, to help Germany modernize some of its structures through pretty incisive interventions that derived from the principles, of course, of the Sozialmarktwirtschaft, because competition is one of those, and derived from the treaty. So it was very interesting in those years of a Germany still stressed by the post-unification process to cooperate with the German authorities at the federal level, but also at the level of the Länder, including Saxony, in order to help them, albeit through some constraints, to seek more development and adopt more modern and competitive structures, including in the banking system. And then, when I was Prime Minister in Italy, of course I came, as was kindly reminded, at a moment which was not the easiest one for Italy, and my cooperation with Chancellor Merkel and Federal Finance Minister Schäuble has been inspired to the greatest will by the German authorities to help Italy come out of that very difficult moment. But help not meaning help through financing. They perhaps might have been ready to do that as well through the instruments of the European stability mechanisms and so forth. But we decided not to seek that help, but indeed we sought and got and used the moral and political help of the leading country of Europe, showing great proximity to us when we were making our very painful efforts to respond to the crisis, which is our topic today. And allow me just one reference to what Italy did afterward. Italy is the only country in Southern Europe that has come out of the financial crisis of the last few years without a program, without any financial help, without a troika installed in Rome, and is currently again the only southern country of Europe which has gone out of the excessive deficit procedure by the European Commission, because its account concerning the deficit are in order. Of course, Italy still has a huge public debt, a legacy of many decades, but it is the only country in Southern Europe to have made this pretty dramatic budgetary consolidation process. And when I say Southern Europe, from this particular point of view, I imply a broader Southern Europe, because also France, or Belgium, or Slovakia, or should I say even the Netherlands, are still under excessive deficit procedure. Business, the corporate world, has not been, except perhaps for financial business, a key driver of this crisis, but has certainly been a deeply immersed protagonist of the crisis, and many times the victim of the crisis. So I'm sure that our colleagues who are professors of business economic, business administration, also public sector administration, public management, know a lot about the conditions in which the corporate world has found itself during the crisis. During, one could say, the euro crisis, the crisis of the euro. But I think we should be vigilant and very intransigent there, especially when we discuss with our non-European colleagues. This has by no means been a euro crisis. This has by no means been a crisis of the euro. And we should not accept, those of us who believe in the euro, that for language, simplicity and speed, this is called the euro crisis. No, no. A currency like the euro can be tested as to its condition of health or crisis in terms of both its domestic purchasing power in terms of goods and services and its external purchasing power in terms of other currencies. And as we know well, in terms of the price of goods and services, well, if anything, the big concern of the moment, sometimes I believe even to some limited extent in the German perspective, is deflation rather than inflation. And from the point of view of the exchange rate of the euro relative to the major currencies in the world, more people would be ready to say that the euro recently has been too strong, particularly in France, then they would be ready to say that it has been too weak. So this has not been a crisis of the euro. From the point of view of the euro as a currency, this has been almost a triumph. I believe we should really pay tribute, in particular to those who led the European Central Bank in all those still initial years, Wim Duisenberg, Jean-Claude Trichet, Mario Draghi, because they were really very performing in achieving credibility soon. It is very difficult for a young institution, which of course is created against the background and the shadow of a mega institution of economic history like the Deutsche Bundesbank, to gain credibility so soon and to allow Europe to have interest rates similar to those that were enjoyed in the strongest, from the point of view of money, country in that union. This happened. This happened, and I believe it's equally due to the strength of those personalities and the quality of the ECB, but also very much to the template, to the model on the basis of which the ECB was created, which is very much, though not completely, the model of the other institution in Frankfurt, the German Bundesbank. And so, by the way, I will be very careful when there are discussions about whether the powers, the mission of the ECB should not be modernized to be aligned to that of the Federal Reserve System, for example. I would think twice. First of all, because we have seen practically that even the narrow mandate about monetary stability has allowed the ECB to display considerable imagination and flexibility, still clearly remaining within its mandate. And secondly, because I would be a bit concerned the moment that in Europe we would say, okay, economic growth has to be added to price stability to be another objective of monetary policy and of the ECB, well, we all know and respect politicians, but I think that I would not feel very reassured if European politicians, both at the national level and at the EU level, could relax mentally by saying to themselves and to their electorates, yes, Europe is not growing, but that's the fault of the ECB, because they have growth in their mandate and they're not delivering growth. Whereas we know that most of the actions badly needed to bring back Europe, the eurozone, and not just Germany, to a more satisfactory rate of growth, most of the actions are actions to be conducted in the real economy by the way of structural reforms, for which the direct incidence of the ECB is doubtful. So, not a crisis of the euro, a euro whose idea, concept, supporting institutions, personalities chosen to handle it has come out pretty strongly from this terrible crisis. What has it been, if not a crisis of the euro? Well, it has been simply a huge combined fiscal and banking crisis in many countries of the eurozone, although not a crisis of the euro. And we all know that even in that respect, the fiscal parameters, the aggregate amount of the public sector deficit and even debt in the whole of the eurozone was, even at the peak of the crisis, lower than it was in the US or the UK, not to speak of Japan. But it was, of course, a maldistribution, a distribution of these fiscal imbalances that created very serious problems to the governance of such an internally unbalanced union. The response to the crisis, I believe, has been no doubt slow, no doubt characterized by many uncertainties, but altogether coherent and even surprisingly effective. Now, it has required a number of actions, combined actions at the national level and actions conducted centrally at the EU level. The crisis, the eurozone crisis, has proved once again a very permanent truth, particularly valid for the European Union, but I believe for the life of every entity, that the crisis pushes to decisions that in times not of crisis are so much harder to take, even though they are intellectually seen as necessary. It has been systematically the case so far that Europe has been able to construct a better self on the basis of the crisis. And the first example of that was, of course, if we can call it just a crisis, World War II and the very concept of European integration to try and prevent the further repetition of that tragedy. In the case of the crisis in the eurozone, we have seen very strong response at the national level, about which, however, I will say something in a moment, and also a response of things to be done in common. And it is remarkable how simple necessities of the working of a monetary union that had been declared necessary by the European Commission for years, but systematically rejected, particularly by the large member states, all of a sudden after the Greek crisis became obviously necessary and to be adopted immediately. Two small examples. The Commission for a long time had proposed that more powers of effective monitoring and inspection should be given to Eurostat, the European Statistical Office, concerning public finances at the national level, including, of course, Greece, like any other country. Systematically, and it was particularly Germany, France, I believe also Italy, said not even imaginable. We don't want those intrusions. Well, after it was seen that the figures for the Greek budget were not exactly credible to the last decimal figure, it was immediately decided to give those powers to Eurostat. Or the Commission had proposed many times that each national government should, before sending its draft budget for the following year to its own national parliament, send it to Brussels for a mutual consistency check, rejected by the same spirit of over-intrusion. Immediately after the Greek crisis, this was accepted, and the so-called European semester procedure started, whereby in the first part of the year, this more Brussels-based exercise is played by each national government, and only then do governments submit the budget to national parliaments. Of course, we can have lengthy discussions about political union. It can be defined in abstract, but it can also be observed in concreto, and I believe that such a measure goes a certain way towards the equivalent of a political union. If there is incorporated in the constitutional processes this need for a check for consistency even before the national budgets are approved. I think it's also fair, we are here from many countries, we meet in Germany, I am Italian. I think it would be fair to say that the crisis, the fiscal and banking crisis within the eurozone was not created by the South in Europe. It was, the initial seed was posed in 2003 when the two parents of the euro, Germany and France, thought that they had good rights to temporarily diverge from the 3% rule. And although the European Commission, of which I was then a member, proposed to the Council to start the procedures to warn the two member states that they should correct their fiscal policies, both were able, with their considerable strength, and at that time they were playing at the unison, by the way, remote memories, I believe, they were able to persuade the Council not to adopt the proposal of the European Commission. And to be fair, there was the complicity of Italy, which was chairing the Council during that half year, the second part of 2003. And so the Council turned down the proposal of the Commission, inflicting a very serious damage to the credibility of the Stability Pact, and many years were subsequently needed to produce other pieces of legislation at the European level, the six-pack, the two-pack, the fiscal compact, a whole category of massive enforcement instruments to rebuild the credibility of the Stability Growth Pact. If you are Greece, maybe you have a fantastic tradition in all respects of human life and culture, maybe not in the particular narrow, almost irrelevant aspect of fiscal discipline, and you see that Germany and France take the liberty to derogate into it. You are not particularly encouraged to take very, very seriously the Stability and Growth Pact. So it took some time to send back the proper messages. I do not say it at each passage in my speech, but obviously everything that is done or not done or contradicted or postponed in these policy areas has an impact on the entities that you study and with which you consult and that you advise companies, because obviously all this is so relevant when it comes to forecasts about the rate of growth, about interest rates, etc., etc. I forgot to say that in terms of the actual everyday life of a company, we can see how successful the euro was if we think what would have happened in Europe if the euro had not been introduced in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 financial crisis coming at that time from the United States. We would have seen an avalanche of competitive devaluations among the different currencies of European countries, relative to which what we saw concerning Italy in 95-96, which disturbed very much the industries of other member states, would have been, I mean, in this case, had we not had the euro after the financial crisis, all that would have been multiplied and the life of companies would have been very much disrupted. The policies for responding to the crisis, therefore, have been both at the national level and with increasing elements of shared responsibility. In particular, through the provision of the so-called firewalls to allow isolation of the different national markets relative to the contagion that could have come financially from one failing country, and also in terms of more incisive monitoring of the different fiscal policy, and then more recently with the construction, which is not yet complete, of the banking union. I have been living these different steps these different building blocks of responding to the crisis, initially as an observer, then as Prime Minister and Finance Minister of my country. So I was able really to see the mechanics of these political reactions to the crisis. And I'd like to make a couple of observations here. One, I had the advantage, although it was a bit heavy, to be for 8 months also Finance Minister, not only Prime Minister. So I was participating in the ECOFIN councils, in the Eurogroups, and in the European councils, where the heads of states and government meet. I saw there an enormous good faith common effort, which brought to some important results, but also really the lack of a political Europe. And even the lack, with the present degree of institutions, of institutional union, the lack of a political discussion. I was the only not really politician to be sitting around that table. All the others were real politicians, some of them great figures. But they were so busy, we were so busy with Greece, with Cyprus, with bailing in and bailing out, etc., that honestly never once in those almost monthly meetings, which I attended for 18 months, never once was there a discussion on but what will be the reactions in the public opinion of what we are trying to do. It was already clear that there was mounting populism in many of our countries and that it was not entirely unrelated to what was devised as responses to the crisis and how it was presented and communicated. And there was never time to discuss that. And we have seen at the European elections that the problem was there. And I think that for the future, the leaders of Europe should find ways to have ex ante real political discussions on how the population perceives and lives through the various policy developments, rather than having a highly concerned ex post reaction. I'm not criticizing anybody. At that time it was difficult to think of anything else, but nevertheless it should have been done. Also, one point which I'd like to underline is the interaction between the political authorities in Europe and the monetary authority, the European Central Bank. It is fundamental. The German who is in me has always been convinced of this, that the central bank in whatever country be independent from political power, and of course accountable, but independent from everyday politics. And this has been the case, and is being the case at the European level, luckily. And I like very much the role of watchdog against any attempt of the political world to interfere with the ECB that Germany has carved out for itself for historical reasons. And I even remember the very first meeting I had once in office with colleagues from other countries was when I was invited by President Sarkozy and Chancellor Merkel to meet with them in a triangular meeting that took place in Strasbourg in November 2011, which was a great gesture of openness vis-à-vis Italy, that sort of help, which is not monetary help, was greatly helpful. We discussed the issue of the independence of central bank, not to put it in discussion, but to see how we should cope with it. And we came and then announced to the press to a very simple conclusion that we called the Strasbourg doctrine of symmetrical silence. Namely, we took the commitment, the three of us, hoping that others would follow, that we, governments of member states, would neither intervene publicly or intervene generally to criticize the central bank for having done something, nor to criticize it for not having done something. So we believe that this discreet silence would put, not only would be in line with the treaty, but would put the ECB in the most relaxed position, and in particular it would avoid to it the unpleasant situation of having sometimes to be perhaps tougher than they would consider normally appropriate, just to prove that they were not responsive to pressures, because pressures were there and publicly. So that the symmetrical silence worked rather well. And and many people believe, on the other hand, that the calm came on the eurozone crisis essentially when the ECB spoke or the ECB intervened. And there is an interesting remark here in a lecture given 2 days ago by President Van Rompuy, and also in his book, which appeared a few months earlier. I quote Mr. Van Rompuy. Yes, the other response to the debt crisis was a fiscal consolidation across a wide range of countries in order to restore market confidence and to correct unsustainable fiscal developments. But the panic in government bond markets broke the monetary policy transmission channels. It created a self-fulfilling crisis in which countries whose debt outlook in other circumstances was perfectly sustainable were threatened. This dynamic, after many dangerous episodes, eventually led the European Central Bank to its famous decision of the summer of 2012, in which it effectively committed to kill such self-fulfilling dynamics by eliminating the anticipation of the breakup of the monetary union. I should add here, however, this is President Rompuy, especially since some commentators attribute the end of the crisis merely to a few magic words of Mario Draghi. The ECB will do whatever it takes, he said early in August 2012, that the central bank was only able to take this decision because of the preliminary political decision by the EU's heads of state and government to build a banking union. This was the famous European Council of June 2012, so just weeks before Draghi's statement. He himself said to me, this is again Rompuy, during that council, that this was exactly the game changer he needed. And we had a very intensive and somewhat tough discussion at that European Council and the eurozone summit in the subsequent hours, to have all the leaders, including the governments of Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, the tough governments from the north, all the leaders agree that there was a good reason to stabilize government bond markets for those member states which were respecting their country-specific recommendations, etc., etc. So when the ECB first stated that it would do so, and then provided the instrument to do so, the outright monetary transaction, it was sure that the leaders of the governments would not react negatively. A last remark before I conclude. The crisis has, of course, brought to a great divide between North and South. I've been living this very, very intensively. I believe the southern countries of Europe have made considerable progress, both in terms of budgetary discipline and of structural reforms. Not enough, and above all, they should not stop here, they should continue. But to continue, they need to see some hope of growth. Otherwise, those populist movements, which Chancellor Merkel was able to prevent from emerging in Germany by having always prudent and some would say somewhat slow responses to the crisis in terms of coming up with instruments of assistance. This, of course, created more anger in some southern countries like Greece. We need to bring back a more common spirit in Europe, and this will require, I think, a continuation on budgetary discipline and structural reforms in the southern countries, but also a greater readiness in the Nordic countries, in Germany and elsewhere, to slightly move towards a policy framework in the whole of Europe that is more encouraging for growth, although not giving in anything concerning budgetary stability. And this is probably something that could be achieved through a greater consideration of the positive effects for growth, but also for the capacity of our economies in the future deriving from public sector investment. And I believe that the policy discussion in the next few months and years will focus very much on this. And I believe this will provide companies in general and companies and the states of Southern Europe with a more congenial policy framework in order to stick to budgetary stability and yet to see the possibility of more growth through serious infrastructural projects. A very, very last word. I have the impression that what comes from Brussels in terms of encouragement, incentive, disincentive to the various countries in terms of economic policy has been so far a bit asymmetrical. since the days of Maastricht, a lot of effort has been put, rightly so in my view, on the fiscal discipline side. And that is assisted by precise figures, 3%, etc., by very strong enforcement mechanisms, and even by penalties and fines. When it comes to structural reforms, which domestically confront governments with even, I would say, stronger resistances than budgetary policy, because when you have to reform a particular sector of the economy, the labor market, or introduce more competition in any sector, you really have to overcome the opposition of very well-organized interest groups. There, the opposition domestically is greater, the help by Brussels has been smaller, because the Lisbon strategy, as we know, has been little more than lip service. So I welcome very much the idea brought up by Chancellor Merkel, President Van Rompuy, but not sponsored by many others, I understand, to have some contractual arrangements between the European Union and each member state, bringing the governments to commit themselves on specific contents of structural reforms with calendars, and maybe even to have some moderate financial incentive from the center, that is from the Union, in order to try and speed up these structural reforms that are necessary for everyone, including, allow me to say, in this country, with all its great economic performance in the area of the services market, there is still, according to the Commission, to the OECD and others, a lot to do in terms of opening up and liberalizing. So, corporate world, economists and academics who work on the corporate world, who guide them through the storms of crisis, I believe should devote greater and greater attention to these apparently macro policy responses, which are having, though thinly ramified effects on companies, and why not, strong with your experience from the ground on how companies behave, what problems they face, etc. Maybe the community of professors and researchers in business economics should become even more vocal and forceful in conveying its input to the European policy authorities to help them go more solidly on the ground in their difficult policy exercise. And thank you very much for inviting me and for your attention.